Welcome, everyone, to the fifth episode of Identity International's second webinar series, Palestinian Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of December on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 5 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, where we will delve into the evolution of Palestinian identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms. And if you miss any of our episodes, please check them out on our YouTube channel. Today, we will be in conversation with Abdulla Moaswes. Abdulla is a researcher and educator originally from Jerusalem, Palestine. His primary area of research is on comparative and connective settler colonialisms with a focus on Kashmir and Palestine. In addition to this, Abdulla has written about politics of internet, memes, chai, and cultural production, and is interested in more generally in ideas of resistance, liberation, decoloniality, decolonization. Abdulla is also the world's only Palestinian cricket fan, an avid reader of Urdu and Arabic poetry, and a graduate of universities of SOAS and Exeter. Abdulla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on this platform.
My first question to you, as you probably already know, is, and it's a running theme throughout this series, is what does it mean to you to be a Palestinian?
That is a tricky question. I was, just saying earlier that in preparation for that question, I actually decided to run through see what all the other people said. But really, the final answer that I came to was that being a Palestinian means being a poet. So that might sound a little bit unorthodox, but I don't mean being a poet in the sense of like sitting down and writing these long epic poems and things like that. Although, some of us are very good at that. I mean being a poet in the sense of understanding certain sort of facets of the world in a very intimate way. So understanding things very intimately, like despair or sorrow or rage. Rage is very important. But then also understanding things that are a lot kinder. Things like, sort of the kindness of a gentle word in the silent darkness. The things like understanding, the touch of a petal amongst the thorns that, are the conditions that many Palestinians have to live through. There's a famous line in Ibrahim Jabra's book, The Ship, where one of his characters says, Palestinians are all poets, even if they don't write poetry, because they know two things: the beauty of nature and tragedy. So I often think back to that sentence whenever I think of what does it mean to be Palestinian. Like, there are many other things I could say as well. Being Palestinian is a responsibility. It's, like carrying a struggle. It's, like all of these things that I'm sure many people have already talked about. But I wanted to kind of contribute to that discourse, the idea that Palestinians also have, this strong connection with feeling certain things about the world. The word for poet in Arabic is sha'ir, someone who feels something, and Palestinians feel things very strongly. I think being Palestinian means like feeling certain things in ways that are very different from how many other people feel it, and having kind of an intimate understanding of things like nature and tragedy, and also comedy. I have to say as well, the best humor often emerges from the most tragic situations. And that's something I came across while I was doing research on internet memes, that actually like the funniest memes and the most relatable memes come from, people who have experienced like great tragedy in their lives. So I hope that that's a satisfactory answer. I mean, there's no one way to answer that question, obviously, but this is kind of what it means to me.
No, I mean, it's a very satisfactory answer, at least from my part. And that's the whole point of this entire series as well. It returns the humanity to the entire discourse, because I think poetry is very good at doing that, is showing humans for being human rather than, just statistics or objects or, people. So that feeling, that depth that you can get through poetry, it's very touching, and that's it's a powerful statement to make, and
in fact, I mean, as I was saying, just before coming live, I was just browsing through a whole bunch of poems that I had been reading over the last several months, because like we've all had a lot more free time than we would have liked to have in the last several months. And there was one poem I came across that I thought was particularly relevant to the question of what does it mean to be Palestinian. Fadwa Tuqan is a, everyone talks about Mahmoud Darwish, but we also have other poets too. So Fadwa Tuqan, not of course to kind of take away from my appreciation for Mahmoud Darwish, but Fadwa Tuqan wrote this poem called Hamza. I can't tell you the exact year that it was written, but I think that this poem encapsulates, in a certain amount of words, what it means, at least, in many different ways to be a Palestinian. A lot of the feelings that you feel between, sort of the lows of depression and sadness and sorrow, up to the highs of hope and expectation, and I wouldn't even say, just I wouldn't say hope of liberation, but I would say even the expectation of it. Whether in this life or the next. And so, with your permission, I'll read a translation of it. So the poem is called Hamza. Hamza was somebody from my hometown, like everybody else, a good man who ate his bread, like my nation's kind people, with the hands that he worked with. He said to me one day when we met, as I beat upon the chaos of defeat, "Be steadfast. Do not feel weak, dear cousin. This land that is harvested by the fire of the crimes, that is racked today by sorrow and silence, this land will stand forever. Its oppressed heart is alive and will never die. This land is a woman, in her furrows and in the wombs. The secret of fertility is one, so strong that it sprouts palm trees, and wheat, it sprouts a fighting nation." Days passed, and I did not meet with my uncle's son, but I knew that the belly of the land would contract and quake with the pains of a new birth. It was 65 years. A heavy rock had settled upon his back when the local commander issued his order, "Blow up the house and drag his son to the torture cell." The local commander issued his order and then began preaching about the necessity of love and security and achieving peace. The soldiers surrounded the house, and the snakes followed, and skillfully completed the circle. They loudly demanded, "Leave the house!" and in their generosity granted them 1 hour. Hamza opened the window under the soldier's eye and the sun, and he grew and exclaimed, "O Palestine, do not fret. I, my home, and my children devote ourselves to you. We live for you, and we will die for you." A quake spread through the nerves of the town when Hamza's words echoed as the house sat still. 1 hour. They rose and then fell. The martyred rooms of the house. The bedrooms crumbled into a heap, embracing the dreams and warmth of the past. With them fell a harvest of lifetimes, memories, years. The house was built out of effort, determination, tears, joyous laughter. Yesterday, I saw my cousin in the street, walking along the path with resolve and conviction in every step, unerring, with his head held high. All I need is to remain within her embrace. All I need is to die on her land and to be buried in it, and to decompose and disappear beneath its soil, and return as the grass on the surface, and return as a flower, picked by the hand of a child, birthed by my country. All I need is to remain within my country's embrace, soil and grass and the flower of a nation's freedom. Thank you. So that's Hamza by Fadwa Tuqan.
That was very powerful. No, but then it's a really good point to go on to, especially after saying that all Palestinians are poets. Yeah, that kind of left me a bit very touched. It's a very powerful poem. It's interesting because it's not a perspective that I've heard on this platform, at least. Whilst conducting these interviews, but it is. I love the artistic and the cultural aspect that comes through this. The uniqueness and the individuality that you can express through the poems, but then there's this coherent brotherhood that you have as well, and or sisterhood within other Palestinians, that they can all relate to this somehow, and it's a very good way of expressing it for people that may not necessarily know how to express themselves either in this manner.
I mean, poetry is a refuge in many ways.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Safe from a lot of things, and using many meanings of that word.
Yes, of course. So no, I think that was a very satisfactory answer in terms of what it meant to be a Palestinian. Now, I would like drawing for that. I would like to read a passage of yours from a blog post that you wrote for Stand with Kashmir, and it's describing what settler colonialism has is. And I found this very interesting. So first, I'll read it and then we'll discuss it.
Sure.
But the violence of settler colonialism is not just that done through categories and paperwork. It is real and painful to the body and soul. The killing of people, the razing of homes, the coercion of land, the murder of trees, the bruising of mountains, the theft of water, the drowning of roots, the isolation of the sea, the building of borders, the scarring of soil, the suppression of words, the diktats of misery. This is what settler colonialism is. It is not natural nor is passive. The screeching of fearful children, the wail of a father, the dust that covers a mother's brow, the defiance of the cactus, steadfast and convinced of its right to stand where it does. It should never be required that a plant fight for the rights of those who planted it. The annihilation of innocence, incarceration of justice, the spread of hunger and thirst. This is all deliberate. This is what settler colonialism is. Let the gravity of each word sink into your eyes and flesh. Now, that's an incredibly powerful description of settler colonialism, because often when we hear about this discourse, it's in a very academic slash, journalistic kind of context, where you have given it sort of personification and add the human aspect of it and what the repercussions of this is. It rightfully reverses the dehumanization of that is being undertaken within Palestine. Could you comment on the dehumanization process and its impact on Palestinian identity?
Yeah. So thank you for reading it out so well, by the way. I appreciate it. I've never actually heard it being spoken out loud before, so that was really interesting. But yeah, dehumanization. So I mean, dehumanization is I think one of the foundational pillars of colonialism and settler colonialism. The boundaries of what it means to be a human have been so essential to being able to kind of build the kind of justifications that are required to be able to get mass buy-in into a colonial project, and to be able to kind of create this kind of I would suppose you would call it like sort of a racialized hierarchy at a global level. Because if you look back into the history of literature that covers colonialism, or literature that was produced out of colonialism rather. So I'm not talking about academic literature. I'm talking about like stories. I'm talking about travel writing. The other day I was having a conversation with someone about a Shakespeare play. I think it was Othello. And I think there's a character in the play. I'm not 100% sure it was Othello, but I could be wrong, but I think it was. A character within a play talked about how they had traveled to what's now modern day Turkey, and how they saw men whose faces were in their torsos. Which obviously sounds like something preposterous. Like, I mean, I don't think I've ever I've been to Turkey. I've never seen anyone who looks like that, or anywhere around Turkey in any of the countries that surround it. But that kind of the movement of that kind of idea, of that kind of image, kind of causes people to think that like, oh, if people who are over there are not quite human, then perhaps it's fine to colonize them. And then Palestinians just happen to be one of many groups who have been subject to this process. Of course, like the foundational myth of Israel, right, is that it's a land without a people for a people without a land. But then the individuals who lived on that land, and the communities and the societies, well, are they not people? That's something that even until today, like, people still like parrot out as being like a line that's used to talk about, to justify the process of colonization that took place over the last 100 years in Palestine. And interestingly enough, like, you have the same representations in Kashmir also, of these like rolling mountains and the greenery, and the greenery, and like these beautiful natural scenes. But then where are the people? But of course there are people there. There are people in every place that is inhabitable. But over the course of history, the justifications for that dehumanization change, and the modes through which it's done changes. So perhaps 500 years ago, the justification for the dehumanization of, let's say, the indigenous people of North and South America was that they were not Christians. The justifications today for the dehumanization of Palestinians are largely rooted in security. Talking about Palestinians as a demographic threat, as a suspect, like nation on in some senses of the word. Many Palestinians who live even in the diaspora, who are in some ways very privileged compared to Palestinians in Palestine, are considered suspect communities and suspect individuals. Palestinians everywhere are subject to all kinds of different mechanisms of dehumanization. That then are used to kind of build, I wouldn't say support so much as kind of like a tacit complicity in the colonization of Palestine, because I wouldn't assume that many people around the world are kind of rabidly pro-Israel. But there is kind of an understanding that, like, oh, Israel is a state, and people don't question that. People are not critical of that. And I suppose a large part of that does come from the idea that Palestinians who lived in Palestine, during the early period of migration, during the early period of Zionist migration to Palestine, we're not humans, and we're not worthy of humanity. Like, especially if you think about, nowadays it's quite horrifying to talk about colonialism. Like when we talk about, like nowadays it would be almost preposterous to kind of very openly say, like, oh, let's go and colonize Cornwall. That's a place that doesn't have that's not very heavily densely populated, but there are people there. It would be very preposterous to go and say, let's colonize Cornwall and turn all the people who live in Cornwall into, like, a subhuman category. Like, that would be preposterous to say nowadays. But 100 years ago, the idea of going and civilizing a place and of instrumentalizing a population was not thought of as being preposterous. In fact, it was thought of as being like the thing that's done. Like, that's what powers do. And so that's kind of kind of this process of dehumanization that has brought us to where we are today. And I think that actually, like, in the last, given that since the 60s there's been a large push, at least an official kind of performed push towards decolonization around the world, and particularly since 1990. I think 1990 was declared the year of, what is it, the year or the decade of decolonization or something like that, by the UN. So there's been this kind of, like, sort of verbal push, and to an extent, in some limited ways, a practical push towards decolonization. There has to have been a change in the template to how people are dehumanized now. It's not quite so simple as saying, like, oh, they're racially inferior, or oh, although that still exists. Jared Kushner himself said that, like, oh, like, Palestinians don't know how to run an economy. Not in those words exactly, but he kind of alluded to that idea. As if there's something about being Palestinian that suggests that we don't know how to run an economy, which actually is quite funny, considering that many diaspora communities of Palestinians are built on the backs of entrepreneurs. Not that that makes it okay, but it's just an ironic, juxtaposition. But I think, yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question?
No, it does. I mean, the interesting part of it was that when you mentioned this sort of, there's a logic and there's a rationale that's trying to be pushed, right? I mean, this is probably a point that's stemming from what you said. And there's a logic and rationale that's being pushed to justify Israel's existence and the state, right? But and I know this might be
and
very
the mechanisms that brought that state into existence. So it's not quite just to justify the existence of a state. I mean, many states, I think, in my opinion, have to justify their existence. I think many states,
of course.
I mean, kind of, like, we can't take them as a granted, fact. Many states are, we can't exceptionalize Israel in that sense. But, like, to talk about the mechanisms that brought Israel into being, and then there are conversations to be had from there about, like, the legitimacy of states and Israel among them.
Is definitely a more complex argument, but I mean, the specific mechanisms that are being used in Israel, I think some of the time they what's the word that I'm looking for here? they contradict themselves, you know, a lot of the time, in the sense that and I don't, you know, there's one thing that's being said for Israel's existence and for it to be allowed to exist, and you know, the people and the Jewish people, and the rightfully so, you know, they have suffered, and they have gone through extreme troubles throughout European, you know, before if you want to talk about the 1700s and the anti-Semitism that was very prevalent during this time, and there's no doubt about that. You know, it's very evident. But it's at the same time, it's okay, that exists, but then why doesn't it apply to the Palestinians? Why does it not?
Like I said, are very contradictory. I mean, I remember in a debate when someone said to me that, no irony, right? Like one sentence. Yeah, Palestinians never existed until 1964, but they sold their land in 1948. So like,
this is exactly
for me, you know.
This is and this comes across a lot of like the mainstream debates, whether it be like, you know, the Oxford Union debates that you hear, or the ones that you hear on sort of Intelligence Squared, that, you know, on topics of whether anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, and a lot of I think if anyone even gives it, you know, a little bit of attention, you can see where people are contradicting each other in terms of just justifying, you know, okay, this rule applies for us, but it doesn't apply for them. And it comes across very easily as well. So no, it is a very interesting point. There's, you know, it's you mentioned Kashmir a little while ago. In your research, you have focused on parallels between what is happening in Palestine and other regions, such as Kashmir. In one of your other interviews, I heard you mention South Africa as well. So, you know, there's your focus is on a lot of these regions that are undergoing some form of, you know, settler colonialism / apartheid / you know, other sort of frameworks that have been applied to the different regions and the conflicts that are exist. What is your motivation behind that? How has this impacted you as and your place as a Palestinian? You know,
right. So I got very interested originally in Kashmir, I suppose, because I grew up in the UAE. Sharjah is my hometown where I was raised, and I grew up obviously like in a very like, you know, heavily South Asian community. And so, you know, I learned to pick up on certain cultural cues, and then later on I lived in Pakistan for a while, so I learned some Urdu as well, but don't test me on it because it's awful at the moment. And I thought that, you know, like I was inspired by this tradition of Palestinian solidarity with other causes around the world. You know, you look back to like the Black Panthers, you look back to the Algerian struggle, and Palestinians, wherever they traveled, embedded themselves to a certain level within you know, the struggle of indigenous communities and oppressed communities in those places. And so I thought that given my own position as someone who grew up, you know, in a heavily South Asian community, who picked up, you know, like the ability to talk to people in languages other than English and Arabic, that it became my duty at least to then do research on that side and to be involved in that regard. I'm not the first. Definitely not. There is an old tradition of Palestinian Kashmiri solidarity that goes back very far. Of course, it's not been as strong, perhaps, maybe since the 90s, but it's growing again nowadays. But I decided that I was interested in that. And later on, I started to, like, you know, notice not just parallels, but connections, actual, you know, like tangible interconnections between what's going on in Palestine and what's going on in Kashmir. And so then this caused me to develop, you know, a little bit my thinking about settler colonialism. And I don't think I'm the first to make this argument, but it's one that I strongly believe in, which is that settler colonialism is not something that's limited to certain areas. It's not discrete. It's a global process. In fact, a planetary process, because it also involves many things that are not human. You know, like in the passage that you read yourself, you know, talking about, you know, the cactus plant, you know, talking about scarring soil, talking about the sea, you know, like a lot of it as well involves changing actual physical land. You know, it's not only something that's inflicted on humans. A lot of, you know, what settler colonialism involves is deeper than that. And so, yeah, I was interested in making this argument, or at least supporting this argument, that settler colonialism is a global or even a planetary process. Like, it's something that if you have one settler colonial process going on in one place, almost certainly it's connected to others, and almost certainly it's connected to other forms of inequality, injustice, oppression that are happening elsewhere that may not themselves be settler colonial or even colonial in the first place, but they're connected because systems of oppression, unfortunately, have wide utility value. Being able to monitor Palestinians on a day-to-day basis is just as useful as being able to monitor Muslims in New York, for example. Not that I'm saying that these are the same thing, but these mechanisms, I'm sure there are parallels and echoes between them. Or monitoring, like Kashmiri youth in Kashmir, even though that's a settler colonial process. And actually, I mean, you want to talk about, the United States is also kind of settler colonial par excellence, but there are many other examples as well of like these similar techniques being repeated in places where the mode of oppression is not necessarily settler colonial. It could be something else. It could be kind of it could be the problematization of a particular ethnic group, in a certain place, or a religious group, or a linguistic group, or even not any particular. I suppose you wouldn't call. I suppose not any particular community in per se, but rather like dissidents. These techniques, these methods, these technologies, they have value outside of settler colonial processes. And of course, there's kind of a symbiotic relationship between needing that kind of thing to exist elsewhere in the world and needing, somewhere where these technologies are used very effectively on a population. And not just technologies, but discourses as well. It's a lot deeper than just, like hard material technology. But that's kind of the argument that I tried to support, which is that settler colonialism, that all basically I would say most settler colonial projects are interconnected in some way, and not necessarily through like official relations or not even secret relations, but just the control over like what justifications fly, like what justifications are permitted, within kind of the sphere of I suppose you would call it the international community or the community of people who are concerned about a particular issue, or the community of people who are aware or who have some inkling of something happening somewhere in the world.
Now, and how would that you say that has impacted, you and the way that you've maneuvered through this sort of, like you mentioned, going to Pakistan, right? And or I'm not sure. Have you mentioned? Have you visited Kashmir, or was it just
not Indian occupied Kashmir? No.
no, but the Pakistan side?
In very limited ways. Like I didn't spend very much time there. I did the very touristy thing, which a lot of people do when they go up there.
Fair enough. But as a Palestinian,
I was deeply interested in settler colonialism academically.
right.
But yeah, sorry, you were gonna say.
No, I mean, the whole thing was as to how this has sort of impacted you and your place as a Palestinian, right? Like, and how that sort of connects the connections and between Kashmiri society and your sort of interactions with other Kashmiris or other people from, these societies. How has that been?
So yeah, so I mean, when I was in Pakistan, I was fortunate enough to be around, different Kashmiri communities, either close to AJK or in Lahore, where I was staying for a long time, and in Gujranwala in particular, which is somewhere that I spent a lot of time in for some reason. Yeah, I mean, my interactions were always very positive, and in fact, like that's when you start to feel that like there is this solidarity that exists in a very functional way. So I remember, like particularly when I went up into sort of the mountain areas, and you'd see like the people very proudly displaying the flag of Kashmir on their desks in their shops, and I would talk to them and ask them about that. And of course, when I say I'm Palestinian, everyone's like so excited that like, oh yeah, we're the same. We're brothers in struggle, or siblings in struggle, I should say. But many of the people I met were men, so we were brothers. There was one scenario where I wanted to purchase a hat. I like hats, so I wanted to purchase a hat. It was a beautiful sort of green hat, and green is also a great color. And so when I said to the shopkeeper, I obviously I asked for the price of the hat, and he gave me a price that was I knew was like way above what it was worth. And then we just started talking, and then he said, "Oh, I noticed that like you're not from Pakistan." I said, "No, I'm not." He asked where I was from. I said, "I'm Palestinian." He goes, "Oh, why didn't you just say that?" And then he lowered the price to something that was much more reasonable. I think actually probably below reasonable. But I as a matter of principle, I refuse to take things for free.
Yeah.
Later on, a friend of mine who was with me on that trip, who was not Palestinian, who was very visibly also not Palestinian, went in to buy a similar hat. And when I said, "Oh, but you gave it to me for this price," "Oh, but you're Palestinian. You're my brother. We have to support one another." That story I always thought was kind of touching. There were many others that were very similar, but I like the one about the hat because I like hats. And know that the way to my heart is to buy me a hat, a good hat, a good hat, or a good tea or something.
Yeah, chai, which we've. I hope our guests have enjoyed, and our viewers are also.
So today I'm not drinking karak chai. I'm drinking shai maramiya, which is a very popular way to consume tea in Palestine. It's black tea with sage.
Okay.
And this is kind of like our staple tea that we drink.
Right. Okay.
Over there. And then of course it's important to talk about as well, like growing herbs in Palestine. Of course, a lot of tea is brought in from outside because that's the nature of tea, and tea itself is a very important history as something that like travels around the world. But we grow sage, and of course one of the other really popular herbs that we grow is za'atar. And of course there's a long history of colonial meddling in how za'atar is grown and how it's consumed. And in the end, actually, a lot of I know in London you can buy Palestinian za'atar in certain stores. Actually, I think I used to buy it at SOAS. Surprisingly enough.
I think SOAS's student union shop definitely had Palestinian dates in it, but I'm sure you could have got za'atar.
I think the same company that packages those dates also does za'atar.
Okay.
They do them in small jars. And people are always like so taken aback by like, oh wow, this is really good, which actually it is good. But the real za'atar, like the real good za'atar, is like wild za'atar, za'atar that's not farmed. But unfortunately, Israel doesn't allow people to pick that za'atar, citing environmental issues.
Such as?
I mean, I can't go into the science of it, but they cite like these environmental issues.
Okay.
And it's really ironic because actually, like Palestinian farmers know how to, they know how to pick and treat wild za'atar. So it's quite ironic then for basically for colonizers to come in and say like, oh, actually, like let's tell you how to treat this plant. But that's another form of kind of like trying to break the Palestinian connection to the land and also Palestinian identity to a certain level as well. Because za'atar is very strongly associated with Palestinians because za'atar is always consumed with olive oil, and of course the olive branch is a very strong and powerful symbol of the Palestinian struggle. So that's just kind of a random aside that I thought I wanted to talk about that was inspired by my cup of maramiya.
No, of course. I mean, I'm just drinking really basic green tea here, so it's I think it's even what is it?
We'll have a conversation actually later on because I know this is not really relevant to the topic of this discussion about British companies profiting from tea. Given the violent history of the British Empire and the consumption and not the consumption the sort of movement and consumption of tea, the circulations that had to take place for tea to become a British staple.
Are there papers on this? Because I've never actually. It's very interesting.
Yeah, there are definitely papers on this.
I definitely need to have a look at that. Please send
but yeah, I just went on a completely random thing.
I mean, this is the whole point. That like the discussions are supposed to be like this. Yes. No. I like the relaxed feeling because it's a small thing which you would never think about. I never knew that about, and I never knew.
Corporations, British companies should not be allowed to profit from selling tea. No. I mean, there's like one of the really popular like tea places in London is the East India Company, and I mean, how can a place with that name,
mine literally
and still, be able to profit off of it with that name, given, the things that have been committed in that name as well.
But it
The
says a
kind of
lot, doesn't it? It says the
tremendous
audacity of it.
historical, violations of human communities that have taken place in the name of that company. But yeah, it does say a lot. I mean, it does say a lot about, kind of our relationship as people who experienced the British Empire, with that colonial past. I know a lot of people who go to London and they buy it because, they're like, oh, it's good tea, but actually, like, and to be fair, it is not horrible tea, but they should not be able to profit off of it.
No, I
Don't
mean,
ask me
it is
how I
someone
know
else's product. Sorry?
that. Don't ask me how I know that, but
No questions asked, but I definitely agree with the sentiment. I've never. I think they do free tasters like every now and then, and this is they do, right? They do free tasters in their
I'm not sure
shops.
about East India Company in particular, but I mean, there are excellent ways to, consume tea that is made by all these various different, kind of
Right. Yeah,
companies
but the
and
tea. I
people,
mean, it is still
My favorite thing
mind-boggling.
about academic conferences, by the way, was like sampling the tea bags that were available. So I have an entire like stash of just like, well, obviously not anymore because I haven't been to any conferences in person in 2020, but I would normally have an entire stash of tea bags that I've taken from academic conferences. And now I know that if anyone is doing research on me to see if they want to accept me to a conference, they're going to be really careful about,
Their tea.
like what happens when I'm close to the tea and coffee table. So I guess I've just outed myself in a way.
It's fine. I
But
mean, academics get
that is,
exploited
that
all
is
the
the way,
time.
actually, to be aware of. Sorry.
I said academics get exploited all the time. Good tea is the least that they could do, to be honest, with the way that they profit over publications.
But actually, that is a good way to kind of keep aware of how all of these different types of tea taste, including the ones done by the East India Company.
Noted. Definitely noted.
If there are any kind of aspiring, like master students out there who are curious about different types of tea, like academic conferences are really good for this.
Okay, I've definitely
Among
noted that.
other
Pardon?
things. Among other things, they are good for
Yeah,
other things too. I have to say.
I would hope so. But we do have, I mean, I'm noticing the comments kind of go up. I've noticed there's a question here that says, how do we promote indigenous communities and dismantle settler states by also keeping nativist sentiment at bay?
Okay, that's an important question, and that's one I think particularly people who live in I suppose places, like in countries that were once colonizers, and I think probably are still colonizers in various ways, need to deal with. I myself spent time in the UK when I was studying, but I grew up over here, so in the UAE. So for me, like the question of dealing with nativist sentiment has a very different has kind of a very different understanding. Now, when I was in the UK, I mean, like the ways of dealing with nativist sentiment obviously are to, to make sure that that certain narratives are always challenged. One of the best ways to do that is through art. We talked about poetry earlier on, and I think that that's still something we have to talk about now. I remember a while ago, I was at a session where the session was being run by a number of Kashmir activists, and I was asked the question of like list two or three pieces of advice to give from your perspective as a Palestinian academic to people who are involved in the Kashmiri struggle, and one of the things I said was like don't undervalue art. If we think about like the most famous Palestinians out there, they're Palestinians who have been immortalized in art, like or in various forms of iconography. Like Yasser Arafat is very famous for how he wore his kufiya. Layla Khalid is very famous for those pictures of her with the AK-47, or I'm not sure it's AK-47, but with the gun. Those are the very famous pictures of her. Then you have, Mahmoud Darwish is a very famous poet. A lot of people are aware of the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. Ghassan Kanafani, as important as he was as a political figure, is best remembered as a novelist. He is best remembered for the artwork that he produced, his novels. Same thing with a lot of other figures who were involved both in the struggle as kind of political figures and as artists. So I know that like this is a little bit of an answer that doesn't really go to the deep kind of technical workings of how to fight against nativist sentiment. But this is an answer that I think is always important for me to emphasize, because a lot of people think of art as something that's, kind of, we support from a romantic perspective, but actually,
Yeah.
no, it has very practical value to struggles. It's actually, really important in terms of, kind of maintaining, a collective spirit of liberation and of memory. So that's one thing that I would say in response to that question. I know
No,
that that's not a really satisfactory answer, but I think that that's a much deeper conversation and needs to be had with people who are probably a lot more experienced than I am
that's
in
a
in, in,
very
in those cases in which that question is relevant in the way that I think the question was being asked.
I hope it does answer that question. But thank you for that. And okay, so we were talking about chai before.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've done a
More,
lot of your research on
more
your
of it.
cup. You've done a lot of your research on the politics of chai,
Mhm.
and it's some very interesting research regarding this seemingly everyday beverage that I think a lot of us just, see as a pick
Mhm.
me up most of the time. Tell me more about it.
Right. So I mean, I've done a lot of research around the topic of tea in general, but I think the thing that a lot of people know me for is my research on karak chai, or chai karak as we would call it over here. Because I do have to emphasize that like a lot of people think these are the exact same thing, but they're not the exact same thing. I think when you say karak chai in kind of the South Asian way, you're talking about a much better beverage than when we
Okay.
say in Arabic. Yeah, I mean, of course, not to detract from the value of chai karak, but I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think karak chai is much better than chai karak. But and the reason I say that they're distinct is because chai karak, at least the way it's consumed in the Gulf, emerges from a very particular history of migration and material conditions. So of course everyone knows, the kind of story that's always told, which is that many people came from the south of India, in particular, over to the UAE. At least I can't really speak for the rest of the Gulf, um, and started making this beverage. But then, there is a big difference between the beverage that's consumed here and the beverage that's consumed in India, which is the milk. Of course, when you are making chai karak to meet demand of a large community of people who are blue collar workers, um, you need to be able to work with milk in particular in a very innovative way, because milk is something that is easily perishable, like it goes bad really quickly. um, and it's not easy to cook milk, for the amount of time that you would need to be able to serve like large groups of men. So of course, what started to be used instead of fresh milk was canned milk,
Huh.
evaporated or condensed, which is of course much easier to store because it doesn't need to be refrigerated, especially in an environment like here where it's very hot all the time. Actually, it's actually fairly cold at the moment. I have my windows open and it's actually quite cold, but it's normally really hot all the time. And it's not easy to store milk, so you store these canned milk cans, and it gives the tea a different texture, a different flavor, when it's actually produced, which is not as good in my opinion as the ones you get with fresh milk. I know this is like scandalous for like all my friends who are following, because this is me essentially saying that like there's things better than chai karak out there, but actually there are many things better than chai karak out there, but chai karak is still really good and very important. um, so I mean, yeah, um, so really, chai karak, the way it's consumed over here, emerges from a very particular set of conditions imposed by the brand of capitalism, that in a way built the UAE that we know today. So chai karak as a beverage and as a cultural phenomenon is very intimately tied with that process of migration and economic planning or lack of planning, because of course capitalists always like to say that they don't plan, but they actually do plan, but just differently.
Excellent.
Yeah, the hidden hand, which we can actually all see. But anyway, um, but it's tied to that. So it emerges from that, from a very particular form of what we would say, I suppose, is a working class cultural production or culinary production, that then gets taken up by all of these people who are far more privileged. And there's an interesting question done of alienation. It kind of reminds me to an extent of, did you see, the Rowan Atkinson skit, the Tory Party conference?
Unfortunately, not.
Okay, so this is a skit that he made like back in, I think, the 70s. It was like when he was still a very young, up and coming comedian.
Right. Okay.
Where he plays the role of a Tory politician at the Tory Party conference, after they won the election in the late 70s, when Thatcher came to power.
Right.
And one of the famous lines from that skit is, I love Indians, I love curry, and I love Indians, but now that we have the recipe, do we really need them to be here? Which is a very well remembered line, because I think, in many ways it encapsulates the sort of the right wing British perspective on migration.
Quite rightly so applicable decades later.
Yeah, but then you think that, like, actually, like, if you think about who runs like all these curry houses in the UK, right? Like, you have actually, not only Indians, but you also have like Bangladeshis who run them as well, right? And
Yeah.
and there's a whole kind of like, a whole interesting history behind, like, the particular types as well of dishes that are produced in Britain, right? Like chicken tikka masala, which like is very, not something that would be recognizable, I would imagine, to somebody back in South Asia who has never left,
Yeah,
their
it's
hometown.
difficult when you're trying to explain that to people that aren't South
Yeah.
Asian. They ask you to take them out to a South Asian restaurant, and I'm like, that's not our food.
Yeah. So I mean, like, in a sense, you wouldn't say that British tikka masala is, sorry, British tikka masala. In a sense, you wouldn't say that chicken tikka masala is like sort of wholly something that belongs to white British people. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you do acknowledge that the people who make it are not white British people.
No, true. Yeah.
So there's an interesting cultural relationship, and I suppose also a power relationship, between who makes and who consumes and who claims. And there is, I don't want to go into too much detail about, sort of the ins and outs of it, and how, like, citizenship and residency works in the UAE, but there is an interesting kind of parallel there as well, between, how this drink Shai Karak is thought of as a very important, beverage in the Gulf. Like in London, the most popular Shai Karak place I knew when I was there was Chapati and Karak, which is
Yes.
Qatari owned.
Yes.
And it's in Knightsbridge, I think, which is basically like half of Knightsbridge is owned by people from the Gulf.
No, exactly. Yes.
So like, it's interesting as well of that, like, okay, this is something that is very strongly claimed by a certain population, which I think to a certain extent they have a right to claim, because it was produced in their country, but then it's produced by a different set of people. And so this is an interesting kind of phenomenon to observe, without going too much into further detail.
And if you could draw parallels upon that with the way that Palestinian food has been, the food politics and behind Palestinian food and Israeli appropriation of Palestinian food that's been taking place.
Yeah, so I think, I suppose, an important place to start with is the importance of assigning a kind of, in a sense, a nationality to food. So there is a lot of academic work that talks about the importance of, like, naming where a food comes from. So, for example, go to Tesco, and I'm not sure, it might not be Tesco, it might be one of the other big name supermarkets, but you go to one of the big name supermarkets in the UK, and you get this weird thing called Moroccan hummus or Moroccan falafel.
Right.
It does not come from Morocco. Like, Moroccan cuisine is very rich and very diverse, but falafel is not a part of it. Neither is hummus. But I don't know. I suppose Morocco, in the imaginary of certain people who live in the UK, sounds really exotic, and so naming this thing and I call it specifically a thing because I don't want to give it any more dignity than it deserves. As Moroccan, kind of gives it a certain value to a certain type of consumer. And in addition to that, it creates kind of an imagined scenario of like what Moroccan cuisine is like. And also, it also gives legitimacy to that culture as well in a certain way also. So of course, a conversation that like is very popular on the internet is the origin of hummus. And of course, just today actually, I was reading, interestingly enough, that like the global hummus market is expected to grow by, can't remember the exact number. It might have been like 17% year on year until 2027. And I thought like, wow, there's a global hummus market. Who was the company that was talking about this? It was one of like the big name European food companies. I can't remember which one it was. Who are talking about like hummus as being kind of a healthy snack, and which it is. It's actually quite healthy. And so like claiming cultural control over hummus is actually quite a relevant thing to do. It has its own kind of soft power attached to it. It sounds a little bit comedic, but it's actually true. So there is this kind of like conversation again about what is the origin of hummus, or like what is kind of the nationality of hummus, so to speak. Of course, there are other hummuses as well out there. The Lebanese have their claim, the Syrians, like everybody does. I think the oldest hummus recipe in the world was found in Egypt. So that's another way of claiming it. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. The relationship then exists again between who is claiming a food and who is making it, and what kind of power relationship exists between the people who are making and the people who are producing and the people who are claiming. Sorry, the people who are making, the people who are consuming, and the people who are claiming. So I was reading a while ago, maybe a few years ago, I was reading an interesting article or a book chapter by someone called Gvion, who's, I believe, an Israeli scholar, who said that many people would acknowledge that Palestinians do make the best hummus. Even among Israelis will acknowledge that Palestinians make the best hummus, but they will still claim hummus. There's a very famous restaurant. It's called, I can't remember. I think it's called Diana Israeli Grill or something like that, and it's run by Palestinians, but it's called an Israeli grill because that's how you make your, that's how you benefit from capitalism in a certain sense, that like people will then consume it because it's called Israeli. If you were to open a Palestinian restaurant and call it a Palestinian restaurant in an Israeli town, I think that the scenario would be very different. Even if it's run, even if the restaurant that calls itself Israeli is run by Palestinians, there's still a different dynamic there. It's a different scenario. It's a different politics of culture and of claiming. So I mean, yeah, the question of this power relationship between who makes food and who consumes it and who claims it is a very relevant one, also in Palestine and Israel as well. In fact, probably like that's one place where it's a conversation that a lot of people do know about, actually, because going back to another one of my research topics, this is the subject of many memes, and rightly so. I think this is a great, sort of fodder for memes. Not underestimating the importance of memes as a path of struggle and liberation.
No, I think that's a very satisfactory answer to that question. We do have one last question before we wrap up. Pardon?
Thank you. You think it's because I wasn't sure that it was, but I'm
No,
glad that you think so.
no, it was. You're right, and the way that you were describing it as to who makes it, who consumes it, and then who claims it. Sorry?
Of course, there's a lot more detail that we could go into, but I also realized that we're short on time.
Yes, we are. We're running short on time. So I just want to cover this last question that somebody's asked: is what should we do to stop the ongoing project of selective settler colonialism? Recently, the Indian Army has acquired about 6 hectares of land to build the colony for the ex-army men. Now, this type of a question feels like a very on the ground question. This is the type of a question that I feel like this is somebody that is, and obviously I'm assuming because I obviously don't know the questioner or his background, but these are the type of questions. I mean, even with my little spout in academia, when you would be researching whatever, I mean, I've only done my master's, but the whole, what people would ask is for answers. Answers to big questions and practical solutions, to the issues that are going around. And I mean, I personally felt I had more criticism than answers, a lot of the time. And I don't really have a yes or no or black or white answer. And especially considering sort of a more realpolitik kind of mentality that I do have, it becomes difficult to answer questions like this.
Yeah, it is. It is genuinely really difficult, and this is, I think, the weakness of academia as a sphere. Like it is that we are very good at making very valid critiques. We're very good at gathering all the information, but then posing a practical solution is challenging. Challenging, if not even within the existing framework, nigh on impossible. But there are sort of small areas in which we can have conversations, and I think one of them is departing from the realpolitik perspective. I think like the Palestinian Authority in particular in the last 30 years has attempted to play or at least the last 20 years in particular, has attempted to play a very like realpolitik type of game at getting recognition for the Palestinian state, and I think that this game has absolutely failed. It has exposed the limits of attempting to play realpolitik, and attempting to kind of to do that. There are, of course, there are many struggles that were successful to take inspiration from. The Algerian struggle is incredibly inspiring. The anti-slavery struggles in the Caribbean were, again, like incredibly inspiring. There were many. The anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, again, incredibly inspiring. Like there are these things that we can look at and draw inspiration from that are not necessarily connected to an idea of realpolitik, and are actually connected to situations on the ground. Although I do accept that many of these situations, particularly the recent ones, were affected by kind of global conditions, and really, yeah, I mean, if we think about like the liberation of Palestine, I think it will also need to have some level of connection to a global condition. Same thing with Kashmir. But then when we want to talk about like how to stop things like the Indian army, taking control of land in order to build their settlements, that's not a question I have an immediate answer for. That's a question I would like to have an answer for one day, but I don't have it yet. But at least from my part, trying to demonstrate, these kind of global connections, I think should be able to show us a path towards how people around the world can contribute towards liberation in other parts of the world. So I think that, particularly, from my, kind of to come back to the early question, the first question you asked me, what does it mean to be Palestinian? Being Palestinian has a particular resonance with a lot of people around the world because it's one of the struggles that's almost in the news every day. It might not be in the news in the way we want it to be in the news because, of course, in the news we are dehumanized, we are talked about as terrorists, we are talked about as, people who are violent for no reason. There's this narrative of, Palestinians, Palestine and Israel being two equal powers within a conflict, which is totally not true if you look at the situation on the ground or historically. But despite all of these problems and despite all of these shortcomings in the coverage, we are still in the news, on a very frequent basis. And of course, there are other forms of solidarity as well that tie into this. But being Palestinian means that you do carry, in a sense, a responsibility. When it comes to thinking about liberation, not only in Palestine but globally. Or I should say being a Palestinian who's engaged with this, because of course there are many who choose to be apolitical, or who are forced to be apolitical for either for their own reasons or for reasons that are external to their internal feelings, and that should not be stigmatized either. But I remember a conversation I had, perhaps at this point, maybe 18 months ago, or even longer than that, with a Kashmiri friend who said to me that, like, we need you guys to succeed. Otherwise, we're going to struggle even harder. And that was something that really hit me really hard because I think at that point, of course, I had known that there were these connections. I had known that there were these, like interlinkages. But it had never occurred to me that like one struggle needs another struggle to succeed. And now that I say it, it sounds really obvious, but like it's not something that you kind of think about internally when you're trying to think about how to support your own struggle for liberation. But then, yeah, it's something that totally made sense to me at the time that, like, of course, struggles need other struggles to succeed. Which is why, for example, I encourage many Palestinians to support, the Black liberation struggle in the United States, because it's essential. Not just, I mean, of course, it's not only because it's important to us as Palestinians, but because it is a just struggle as well. But that is one part of it also. So I think that, there can never be too much solidarity. I think that there can never be too much of trying to build these relationships, of trying to build these like global coalitions of resisting settler colonialism. There are ways in which settler colonialism is resisted on the ground. And I'm sure some of the other people who you've spoken to on this platform have maybe talked about it in more detail than I have, because of course I've never lived in Palestine. In fact, my visits there are very infrequent and very few and far between. So there are people out there who can talk about the kind of the nitty-gritty of how to actually do that resistance on the ground in far more detail than I can. But I do think, from my perspective and from my end and from what from my own side, I can say that it is important that these connections are constantly drawn, and that they should be totally not connected to real politics, because in many cases, sorry, I should say that many political entities have tried to use the Palestinian struggle as a way of legitimizing their own injustices. And so if we were to try and play a real politic game and try and see like, oh, who's in solidarity with Palestinians, and okay, we'll be in solidarity with them, we get nowhere. We end up chasing our own tail. But if we were to actually stand in support of causes that are just and causes that are very legitimate and contribute to a rolling back or a transformation or a movement from settler colonialism in the world today, that's something that should be done. And I cannot emphasize this enough, because I've been in so many discussions where I have said to people, or rather, forget me, I'm not that important, but it has been said that Palestinians should be in solidarity with this community, and then they go, oh, but no, but we can't, but because they're pro-Israel. But like, actually, leadership is pro-Israel. Like, it's not always a situation where the people are that as well. So I suppose my answer to that question, again, I'm sorry I cannot give a practical answer on the ground, because I'm not engaged in that kind of in that particular mode of resistance. I'm engaged in other ones, which are different, and I think also important, I would hope. But of course, it's important to also be self-critical and self-reflective. But that, yeah, it's important to constantly be aware of these other struggles, because you can learn. There's a lot to be learned from them. One of the things that also kind of inspired me to pursue this path of academic endeavor or intellectual endeavor. I wouldn't call myself someone who pursues a path of intellectual endeavor. That's very kind of gratuitous, I would say. But this kind of like area of study, let's put it that way. This area of study was in 2014, when you had of course there was the bombing of Gaza in 2014 in the summer. There was also the uprising in Ferguson in the United States, and people were activists on the ground in Gaza, and we're passing on instructions to activists in Ferguson about how to resist things like tear gas, and other forms of crowd control technologies, which I thought was incredibly important and an incredibly powerful move. And that did contribute to a form of practical, on the ground, tangible resistance against the what's the word, the encroachments and the overstepping of the American security state, and its racialized policing priorities. So I would hope that I would hope that I've given at least a little bit of food for thought for how people around the world can engage with different ideas of struggling and resisting, and hopefully moving towards, you know, a substantive and lived liberation that I wouldn't say rolls back the conditions of settler colonialism, because of course Frantz Fanon says that decolonization is about creating new men, but that makes sure that the power imbalances and the kind of power relations that were created by settler colonialism do not dominate a post-liberation or a liberatory future. And that actually those are more based on, you know, things like justice and the rights of human beings, and not being haywan. So
I mean, I think that was a very it was a very sort of, I think it was a very good note to end on, because it does come back down to that, and hoping that people just don't stop being haywan and stop continuing the haywanery. And
I have to say though that when we say haywan in this context, we don't mean animals. We mean like haywans. You know.
no, yeah. I mean, anyone that knows that
We have to be very supportive of animal rights and
no, of course, but
they're also important. It's something that has both secular and a religious value as well. So I should clarify that haywan has haywan said in a very particular cadence has a very different meaning.
Definitely.
Yeah. So
yeah.
thank you very much.
I mean,
thank you for clarify that.
No, of course. But I mean, we have gone well over time. I mean, I don't regret it. I'm sure people watching don't regret it either, to be honest. But thank you so much for joining us and giving us that absolutely incredible insight.
Thank you very much for this conversation. I hope it was beneficial to many people, to anyone who will in. And I'm very excited to watch the next one.
Yes, on which will be next week and Saturday. This week on Saturday, same time, and it will be in conversation with renowned historian Professor Ilan Pappe. And I would like to thank our audience for tuning in today, and thank you so much again for joining us, Abdullah, and your incredible insight. And I would like to thank everybody again from Identity International.
Thank you very much.